Welcome everybody to our latest session in our series on the labor and the left, a history of witch hunts and struggles between the left and the right. Tonight we're very pleased to welcome Graham Bash, a long-time Labour Party member. 53 years he was in the Labour Party, which I've learned now, having heard it a few times, and has been expelled for daring to sign a petition by Labour against the witch hunt 3 years, I think, before it was banned. So it's the latest, one of the latest victims of the witch hunt, not the last one, I'm sure. Very pleased to have him here today to let us know about his many experiences on the Labour left, and in specifically his analysis of the Bennite left in the 80s. Next week, we'll be joined by Roger Silverman, who's talking about militant. So Graham is focusing on that particular aspect. Thank you very much, Graham, for joining us. Take it away.
Okay, comrades, you did exaggerate, Tina. It was actually about 5 weeks short of 53 years. Now, comrades, when I came to look back at the 1980s for this discussion, it really did hit me. Even though I was an activist then, I hadn't fully realised just how much the 1980s anticipated what we've been dealing with in the recent Corbyn years. Karl Marx famously explained that history repeats itself. First time as tragedy, second time as farce. I think today that needs a bit of adaptation. History repeats itself. First time as tragedy, second time as tragedy, and it will continue to repeat itself unless we learn the lessons. So this is not an abstract history lesson. It will be, I hope, a guide to understanding the present, a guide to action. The context is the history of the Labour Party. I'm sure we've had this discussion in recent weeks here, but the Labour Party was created as a conquest for the workers' movement, but deformed from its very outset. Its character was determined by the prior existence of trade unionism, by the early growth of trade unions, and the late arrival of Labour's political representation, certainly in comparison both with Germany and Russia. And this was to help determine both its political and organisational limitations. The party was born as a class compromise, as a contradiction in class terms, created through an alliance between the trade unions and socialist organisations to give parliamentary representation to the trade unions. The Labour Party was, however, based on the separation of trade unionism from parliamentary politics, a refusal to countenance the use of the industrial power of trade unions to advance the political aims of the Labour Party. This class compromise is Labourism. Now, Tom Nairn's classic essay on the Labour Party, which I recommend to everybody, was written in 1964, just as Harold Wilson was forming his first Labour government. He wrote this in New Left Review, anticipating the developments in British society and in the Labour Party in the 70s, 80s, and in the Corbyn years too. He wrote this. He said, the existence of any forceful left-wing tendency with a mind of its own and some basis in the trade unions would transform Labourism. Nobody can say how Labourism would act under a new strain of this sort. Would it be possible to preserve the positive side of Labourism, the unity it asserts among working class organisations on a higher socialist level? Only one thing is certain. Labourism, which has survived every internal and external vicissitude since its foundation, which has drifted on immutably through defeat and the disintegration of its ideas, would no longer be able to function in the same way. Hegel first stated the paradox that a party only becomes real when it is divided against itself, when contradictions battle within it. Labourism was what it was because not divided against itself. What it would become when lifted out of such unreality by an authentic challenge, when lacerated by contradictions which it couldn't stifle or ignore, nobody can say, close quotes. Now that challenge was about to happen in the early 80s for the first time. The 79 general election defeat and the rise to power of Margaret Thatcher was a critical moment in Labour's history. If the first 3 years of Attlee's 45 government represented the high point of Labourism, then the government of Callaghan, representing Labour's right wing at the end of the 70s, with its attacks on the trade unions at the behest of international capital, was surely one of its lowest points. Labourism's attempts at class compromise and mediation between the classes was becoming increasingly untenable in the Britain of the late 70s and 80s. Until this point, Labourism had largely succeeded in maintaining the class compromise which was at its core. This had taken the form of representing, however partially, the economic interests of the working class, but only within the limits of what was acceptable to British capital, and of representing the working class politically, but only within the limits of the British Constitution and the parliamentary system. So Labour began the 80s under the leadership of Michael Foot, veteran leftist, but by now firmly on the soft left, elected leader under the old rules by the Parliamentary Labour Party alone, against right-winger Dennis Healey, who had been expected to succeed Callaghan. Now, the Bennite movement of the 80s challenged the limits of Labourism as no other left-wing movement in the party had done before. There were significant differences from the radicalism of the Labour left in the early 70s. Although the working class movement entered the 80s still undefeated, it no longer had that raw industrial strength of the early 70s and was increasingly vulnerable to the attacks of the Tory right-wing Thatcher government. However, it was, I think, a more politicised left, more focused on the struggle for power within the Labour Party and Labour movement. And Ben himself had travelled far under the impact of his experience of the strength of the workers' movement in the early 70s. He had moved from an insider in Labour's establishment to the spearhead of one of the most significant challenges to Labourism in its history. So in the aftermath of the general election defeat of 79, the Labour left was determined there would be no repetition of the bitter experiences of the Callaghan government. We on the left recognised that one of the key areas of struggle against the new Thatcher government was local government. We began organising to take control of local authorities from Labour's moribund right where we could, in an attempt to use them as bulwarks of defence and struggle. Hence, the fighting role played by Liverpool and Lambeth councils. And in London, the left under Ken Livingstone took control of the Greater London Council. The left went beyond fighting for socialist policies, though it by no means ignored them. Remember, in the previous decade, in the February 1974 general election, Labour's left-wing manifesto commitment was to a fundamental and irreversible shift in the balance of wealth and power to working class families. That actually appeared in that manifesto. There was to be no repeat of this in the 80s because the main focus was now on the structure of the party itself and the fight for power within it. The left proposed that the election of leader and deputy leader be transferred from the parliamentary party to an electoral college. It proposed CLPs have limited rights to deselect sitting Labour MPs, a halfway house, well short of open selection, which the left was pushing later in the Corbyn years. And it proposed the manifesto be decided by the NEC alone, rather than a joint meeting of the NEC and Cabinet, which the party leadership in the Cabinet would inevitably control. Now, the first two of these objectives were passed, the third defeated, at the party conference of 1980. And I remember I was there, with the principle agreed, rather than the details of the electoral college, which was to be determined at a future special conference at Wembley. Now, when Callaghan, in this period, said that the parliamentary party would never accept a leader foisted upon them, he spoke not only for himself, but for 4 generations of Labourism. The simple but radical clarion call for democracy from the Labour left was a challenge to the establishment. The left of the Labour movement was challenging one of the main tenets of Labourism, namely the autonomy of the PLP and its acceptance of the conventions of the British parliamentary system. And at the same time, the left was beginning to organise within the trade unions, through the rank and file mobilising committees and other bodies of the left, not just at leadership level, but at the base of the movement itself. A special conference at Wembley in January 1981 agreed the details of the electoral college. It was 40, 30, 30. 40% for the trade unions, 30% each for the CLPs and the Parliamentary Party. Within days of the Wembley conference, the Limehouse Declaration from Roy Jenkins, David Owen, Shirley Williams and Bill Rogers, all previous Labour cabinet ministers, had set up the embryo of the Social Democratic Party, a right-wing split-off from the party. Tony Benn recognised that the party now had to look beyond its traditional base to new constituencies. In anticipation of Corbyn, he explained this: "We've got to think of the appeal to women, to blacks, to the wider peace movement, to the ecological movement and the regions. I've been shouted at by immigrants and roasted by women, but after 30 years of disappointment, I now feel it is worthwhile taking an interest in us again." That was a profound truth. The Labour left now began to transcend some of its limitations, appealing to forces that went beyond Labour's historic base of the organised working class, predominantly white and male. In this period, the Bennite left began to embrace and respond to newly emerging forces. That radicalised left in local government around the GLC with its radicals fares fair policy for cheap, affordable London transport fares, and in Liverpool, Lambeth and other London boroughs too. It began to embrace a feminist women's movement that left a lasting impact on many sections of the socialist and Labour movement. This was the time, remember, of Greenham Common. And it embraced too the movement for Black and Asian representation in the Labour Party and beyond. The struggle for equality assumed centre stage in a way it had not done before. The 80s was the decade of the new forces in the Labour Party and way beyond the party on race and women's rights. Livingstone's GLC brought into the party a new language and new movements from outside against entrenched racism and sexism that had dominated the party and Labour councils. This was progressive, an essential part of the new movements of the left. Whatever this turned into later under New Labour must not detract from any assessment of its significance. Sorry, I have touched something here, so bear with me. Sorry, there's going to be a gap. The struggle for equality assumed centre stage in a way it had not done before. The 80s was the decade of the new forces in the Labour Party and way beyond the party and on race and women's rights. Livingstone's GLC brought into the party a new language and new movements from outside against entrenched racism and sexism that had dominated the Labour Party and Labour councils. It was progressive, an essential part of the new movements of the left. Whatever this turned into under New Labour must not detract from any assessment of its significance at the time and its lasting impact. The movement for Black and Asian representation was to express itself in the party in the struggle for Black sections, a movement supported by most of the Labour left, militantly accepted, but opposed by the party leadership and a number of unions as divisive. It had to overcome a tradition in which the Labour Party had for a generation or more patronised ethnic leaders, but ignored the real specific problems facing Black and Asian people as a result of racism. And I recall later in that decade voting for Diane Abbott in Hackney North when she won the parliamentary selection by 2 votes, part of the intake of the first Black Labour MPs for 60 years. And Diane Abbott was the first Black woman MP. Remarkable. It was just 35 years ago. So the battle was reaching a climax. In June 1981, Ben, a member of the shadow cabinet, voted against the Tory government in a defence debate, contrary to a shadow cabinet decision to abstain. Ben explained the issue clearly in his diaries. He wrote, "There is really here a very big constitutional issue, a conflict between two concepts of collective responsibility. One is the idea that the shadow cabinet can have a collective responsibility. The other is that the collective responsibility is to the party and party policy and conference policy." Now, what Ben was referring to was the distinction, fundamental distinction, between traditional bourgeois democracy and working class democracy. Richard Crossman, the Labour politician of 60 to 70 years ago, got it right. He wrote that the Labour Party required militants, politically conscious socialists, to do the work of organising the constituencies. But since these militants tended to be, quotes, extremist, a constitution was needed which maintained their enthusiasm by apparently creating a full party democracy while excluding them from effective power. Hence the concession in principle of sovereign powers to the delegates of annual conference, and the removal in practice of most of this sovereignty through the trade union bloc vote on the one hand, and the complete independence of the Parliamentary Labour Party on the other. So Ben and Benism represented a fundamental challenge to the core of what the party had always been. Now, for a brief moment, that movement provided a vision of a Labour Party directly representing the interests of the working class and oppressed, a new and higher unity that threatened to go beyond the constraints that had characterised the party from its creation. It was the high point for the left, but already at this moment of hope, there were developing seeds of defeat. By now, Ben had declared himself a candidate for deputy leadership in what was to date one of the most critical contests in the history of the party, one that was going to determine its direction and future. Ben lost to Dennis Healey, the candidate of the Labour right, by less than 1% in the new electoral college, primarily due to the abstention of the soft left in the PLP section, above all, Neil Kinnock. This was the key political defeat of the 1980s. Ben's defeat was followed by a series of other defeats. Firstly, the attack by Michael Foot, the leader, on Peter Tatchell, who was the parliamentary candidate in a by-election in Bermondsey for an article he wrote on briefing on the need for extra parliamentary action. I recall it well. Peter's article was frankly a bit obvious, and I decided to bin it. I felt sorry to Peter for doing this and retrieved the article from the waste bin. Remember, this was before the age of computers. And after Foot's attack, Bermondsey was lost to Labour for a generation during an anti-left and anti-gay campaign by Simon Hughes for the Liberals. It was now that we saw the beginnings of the process of prescribing militant, begun under Foot, completed, of course, by Kinnock. The parallels with the Corbyn years are obvious. In the 80s, the witch hunt began not under Kinnock, but under Foot. Ditto, current witch hunt began under Corbyn's leadership. And it reflects a common reality that in neither case was the left, or in the case of the 80s, the soft left, in control of the party. But there is a difference. The witch hunt of the 80s was far more limited, not an attack on broad sections of the membership or on freedom of discussion, not part of a trajectory that could lead to the destruction of the party as a party of Labour, which the current witch hunt most certainly can. The next defeat was the Falklands War, which helped a Tory government survive and win the 83 election. The war, supported by Michael Foot, Labour's leader and veteran campaigner for peace. I remember Briefing's brilliant cartoon of Foot in a bath, playing with his warships with the caption, "I'm an inveterate peacemonger, except in times of war." And following the election of Kinnock to replace Foot, there was the defeat of Labour, local authorities in the fight against rate capping and the abolition of the Greater London Council. A key element of that defeat was the division within the left on how to fight rate capping. So then, as has happened now, divisions on the left have aided the struggle of the right. That rate capping struggle laid bare divisions in the left between those who resisted and those who didn't. On this occasion, Ken Livingstone on the wrong side of history and John McDonnell on the right side. And these political defeats were followed by the defeat in the key industrial struggle of the 80s and beyond, the miners' strike, when Labour's leaders under Kinnock totally failed to support the working class in struggle. The miners' defeat was the biggest setback suffered by the working class since the 1926 general strike, soon followed by the defeat of the print workers at Wapping. An irony, of course, is that while Labour Party members made a vital, key contribution in building support for the miners throughout the country, it was Labour's leader Kinnock who played a key role in the defeat of the strike. And on the basis of that defeat, he was able to move Labour to the right, preparing the ground for the rise of New Labour in the following decade, the outcome above all of the defeats, political and industrial, suffered by the working class and the left in the 1980s. In the meantime, and throughout the decade, on the backs of those defeats, the government of Thatcher continued to fundamentally change the political and economic landscape. Now, we cannot understand the Labour left in the 80s without reference to the global context. The 80s signalled too the rise of Neo-Liberalism in Britain and West Europe and the US. It was heralded by the Dennis Healey imposed cuts as early as 76, creating the conditions for the government of Thatcher from 79 and its attacks on our movement. The 80s was also the decade of the death of Stalinism in the Soviet Union and beyond. By the start of the decade, the Stalinist monolith was beginning to crack, anticipated by the growth of an independent workers' movement in Poland, which was supported by most, though I have to say by no means all, of the left. By the end of the 80s, that process of disintegration accelerated in a process that was itself contradictory. The democracy movement in China and the breaking down of the Berlin Wall soon after were outcomes of movements for freedom and liberation that socialists had to support. But the consequences in China and Eastern Europe, though very different, indeed opposite, were reactionary in both cases. In what perhaps I describe anyway as a democratic counter-revolution, there was an historic victory for world imperialism throughout Eastern Europe as the Stalinist states disintegrated. The opposite of this happened in China, where the protests in Tiananmen Square were drowned in blood. I remember a discussion I had with a leading member of Socialist Action in my CLP at the time. He supported the crackdown on the democracy movement in China. And I remember saying to him, I thought we were divided by political differences. In fact, we're divided by rivers of blood. These developments occurred as the Labour right was consolidating its power after the defeat of Bennism. Perhaps the most telling international comparison between then and now is in the fight against apartheid. In the 80s, the fault line in global resistance was the fight against South African apartheid, just as the international issue of our time is the struggle against apartheid in Israel and in support of Palestine. But there is a key difference. In the 80s, the defenders of apartheid were the Tories, Thatcher and the far right of the Tory party. For all his dreadful faults, Kinnock was no supporter of South African apartheid. The opposite of today's Labour leader, who in his recent speech to Labour Friends of Israel hit a new low, defending apartheid and settler colonialism with his nauseating reference to how Israeli social democrats enabled the flowers to bloom in the desert. The Labour right of the 80s still had some way yet to travel to reach the political barbarism we see in the party today. Now, we need to understand the class bases of the left of the 80s and of now. I've argued that one of the key contradictions of the Corbyn years was the contradiction between the most left-wing leadership in Labour's history and the weakness, decline of the organisations of the working class since the defeat of the miners' strike in the 80s and the low ebb of class struggle. Compare this with the Bennite movement of the 80s. Unlike Corbyn, Ben was never leader, never even deputy leader. Unlike Corbyn's party, whose membership rose at its peak to 600,000, the membership of the 80s, even during the Bennite period, was barely half, just over 300,000 at its peak, usually just under. But the trade union movement was far stronger, as I've said, lacking the raw strength of the late 60s and early 70s, but undefeated until the miners' strike. Now, in my research on the 1980s, I've spent a number of happy hours rereading London Labour Briefing, which I edited at the time, the House Journal of the London Labour Left in those frenetic days. We had, for instance, the first issue, I don't know if you can see this, written by Ken Livingstone, or the second issue, number 2, front page written by Jeremy Corbyn. It's so familiar in many ways. What just strikes me is just how embedded the left was in the Labour movement of that period. The pages speak of action, of struggle, of passion, and of solidarity. Our slogan was London Labour Briefing, reporting London's news and making it. It was a magazine of action. We tried to avoid dry abstractions, showing all the humour, irreverence, mischief, anger, and bitterness that we as human beings possessed. Hence our hit list of those we wanted to deselect at local and national level for a period that appeared in almost every issue, to be followed in the next decade with our series Class Traitor of the Month. These pages speak of conflict between left and right, and within the left, arguments about action as well as theoretical disputes. They speak of sellouts, capitulations, betrayals, both from those who were our enemies on the right of the party and movement, and from those who had been our friends on the left. They speak of denunciation, and they speak of defeat. These are the themes familiar to so many of us active today. And looking through these pages, I see these bitter attacks on Ken Livingstone, the attacks coming from the left on rate capping, and on John Landsman as early as the 1980s for, quotes, trying to use black and women comrades as tokens for a hierarchical view of party democracy and a top-down Stalinist model. Well, comrades, we'd been warned. That was in briefing in 1986. There were articles written by those who subsequently defected to the Labour right. David Blunkett, Margaret Hodge, Reg Race, and there were, of course, many articles on Zionism from, yes, Tony Greenstein. We were denounced by Thatcher for our reporting of the Brixton riots, accusing us of attacking anarchy. My favourite headline, no confidence in Kinnock before he was even elected leader. We had no intention of giving anyone a fair chance. And there were errors and U-turns. After the Brighton bombing in 1984, Briefing committed the unpardonable sin of expressing human sympathy for Tory cabinet ministers who were injured or killed. We thought we were connecting with the feelings of the broader Labour movement. My God, what an error. Our phone never stopped ringing as outraged supporters denounced us. We were forced to publish a grovelling retraction in the next issue. And then there is the familiar call in the aftermath of what was the latest sellout. Regroup and fight back. There's about 3 or 4 of them in the 80s. Whenever there's a problem, whenever we're defeated, we call for the regroupment of the left. History indeed repeats itself. And under the pressure from the women's and anti-racist movement, we recognised that we party members and trade unionists were also women and men, mothers, fathers, single parents, lesbians, gay men. We were racially and sexually oppressed We were rape victims, disabled, victims of mental institutions. And the Street Life supplement in briefing was born, where we wrote personally about our experiences of oppression and developed political conclusions from it. At the time, it was groundbreaking. It was liberating. It helped to deepen our political understanding. Above all, it was unifying. What a difference with today, when some of these debates are helping to divide us. Now, finally, comrades, a word on revolution and counter-revolution. Words I use deliberately loosely. After all, we are speaking about the British Labour Party. I've referred to the crisis of labourism, that class compromise, that class contradiction, which in the 80s, the rise of Bennism attempted to resolve in the interests of the working class. Its failure and the subsequent defeat of the miners led to the rise of New Labour, a counter-revolution in these loose terms, in the interests of the ruling class. Defeat of revolution leading to the counter-revolution of Blair and New Labour. There was a 9-year gap between the end of the miners' strike and Blair becoming party leader, during which there was the interregnum of John Smith, a more traditional right-wing Labour leader. Blairism began this counter-revolution, or rather, the foundations of New Labour were built in the Kinnock years, but Blair didn't complete the job because he didn't have to. The parallels with today are obvious. In different historical conditions, in the Corbyn period, the establishment lost control of the Labour Party. The defeat of Corbyn led this time immediately to Starmer. Starmer, unlike Blair, is insecure. Blair had the party behind him, if not enthusiastic, at least acquiescent, ditto the trade unions. Not so with Starmer. The lesson is this: just as it was in more catastrophic, murderous conditions in the last century with fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, fascist Spain, and Pinochet's Chile, what we see is how counter-revolution is the price the working class pays for failing to take power. Blair was the price we paid for the failure of Ben. Starmer, the price we're paying now for the failure of Corbyn. The lessons of the 80s are rich indeed. Corbyn was put to the test in a more acute way than Ben ever was. The economic crisis under Corbyn was far deeper than in the 80s, with the 2008 crash and the long depression that followed. Above all, he was put to a greater test, precisely because he was leader and Ben never was. For that reason, his failings are more apparent. I suspect that put to the test, Ben may have failed too. The common denominator is that both went beyond the limits of what had always defined Labour, in that they both represented a threat to the political and economic establishment. To the establishment, the Labour Party was no longer safe in their hands. In the event of a Labour government under their leadership, this had implications that were potentially revolutionary. Yet neither Ben nor Corbyn were revolutionaries. Ben, unlike Corbyn, would have had in his support an undefeated working class. So we now face, comrades, and I'll conclude with this, an unprecedented crisis in the Labour Party, the unravelling, perhaps the final denouement of Labourism, though we underestimate its staying power at our peril. We are in uncharted territories, but to navigate our way forward, we need more than ever the compass of history, an understanding of how we got here, and above all, an understanding of the 1980s. Thank you, comrades.
Wow, thank you very much, Graham. Well done. That was fascinating, as I expected. We've got about 100 people in the meeting. It shows that other comrades are interested in this subject as well. And as you quite rightly point out, there are lots of parallels or forebearings in Bennism compared to Corbyn, the Corbyn left. And perhaps, yes, he got away with it, Ben, because he wasn't put quite to the test as Corbyn was. I found interesting your description of Labour briefing at the time. Hit lists and class traitor of the month sounds a hoot. I think you were right to apologising for the Brighton bombing. I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions. The LLA has a Republican Labour working group, which is quite interesting, and I've sort of participated in that a little bit from the outside. And they have pointed out how important Ben took the question of constitutional demands, the constitutional democratic demands, which was quite unlike much of the left at the time and at the left still today. He developed a program, including, votes from 16, abolish the monarchy, abolish the Privy Council, House of Lords, etc. Quite relatively radical demands, if even compared to today, from what the Labour left is prepared to fight for, because a lot of times it's perceived as, these are not really issues for the working class. Those things above, they don't really concern us. I think is quite the wrong attitude, and it's quite important to tackle all issues if you're serious about the working class becoming the ruling class. And that touches on something where I would like you to ask your personal view. I think I kind of know it, but I think it'd be still useful, is the relationship between the Labour Party and the fight for revolution. I think we do probably agree that the Labour Party will not bring about revolution, very unlikely in any case, but it is, as I see it, an arena of the class struggle, and remains one for the foreseeable future, as long as the unions are affiliated and the electoral system is what it is. So, we had a couple of questions in the comments, and I'll read them out now as well, but they go to that problem. They ask that problem: how can we, can we ever get hold of the Labour Party again, the left, or is it finished forever? And I think the answer is in that idea of the Labour Party of an arena as the class struggle. It's not the vehicle for socialism, but it's one of the many vehicles we have to win if we ever want to get to revolution. So that's a question from Susan. Can the left wing ever take over the Labour Party again after the right wing coup? Mary asks, and is the Labour as a vehicle for socialism finished? Yeah, well, my answer is that I don't think it is a vehicle for socialism, but it is an arena for the struggle for socialism. Enough from me. We've got a couple of comrades who've got their hands up. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, please click raise hand, or put your question in the Q&A, or just type in the chat, I want to come in, if you can't work out how to do the rest. So Tony had his hand up.
Thank you, comrades. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Unmute myself, it says. Okay, right. Yeah, thank you very much for that, Graham. It was incredibly fascinating and interesting. A tour through the past, but my memory maybe is slightly different from you. I think you view the past through rose-tinted spectacles, in a sense, and that comes out in some of the things that you deal with. For a start, I mean, what you raise at the end, it would have been, of course, fascinating, although it's something we will never know, as to how Ben would have coped in Corbyn's situation, whether he would have had a stronger backbone, whether he would have fought back, whether he would have taken on board the whole anti-Semitism question, which was used, if you like, to drive a stake through the heart of Corbynism. We will never know. But I want to go back really to the 1970s, because you talked about Ben having an undefeated working class at his back, whereas Corbyn had a working class which was extremely quiescent. And on that, I don't agree. If we look at the 1970s, we had the two victories of the miners in 1972 and 74, and the Labour government, if you remember, came into power on the back of the 74 victory. I can't remember whether they actually won before or after, but it was around that time, the February 1974. What happened then was that the Labour government came into power. It abolished the Tories' anti-trade union legislation, but it also agreed with the left trade union leaders, Scanlon and Jones, a social contract, which in essence bound the hands of the working class and the trade union movement until in 1979, if you remember the winter of discontent, when of course the right-wing press went to town over the outbreak of unofficial industrial action with the graves not being dug and so on. And that was the basis on which Thatcherism was launched. And in fact, I would say that the holding back of the working class and the move to the right, in particular in the engineering union, signaled something more than an undefeated working class. The working class itself had been held back. And we saw the earliest example of an industrial defeat was the steel workers' defeat at the very beginning of Thatcherism. That was the precursor to the miners' strike. So I do think that you're viewing it, as I say, very, if you like, benignly and optimistically. And I think there were serious weaknesses in the Labour left. For example, the strategy of fighting the Tories through local government was, I think, in retrospect, a complete failure. I mean, Liverpool fought with Militant, but as you know, I mean, Militant were never really part of the greater Labour left. They kept apart from it. They were incredibly sectarian in many ways. But they did fight in Liverpool, it has to be said. And that was who Kinnock went for. The GLC, of course, which was the great hope, collapsed. I mean, there was a massive campaign around the GLC. What Kevin Livingstone had done was great, etc. But at the end of the day, the GLC collapsed. Lambeth, of course, also went on to fight. But all the other so-called Labour left councils, if you remember, Sheffield under David Blunkett, and Blunkett was then a figure of the left, not the right, they all caved in almost without exception. I can remember briefing, it had an amazing optimism about the potential of local government to conduct that struggle. It was summed up in the most infamous, I think, of briefing headlines. I can't remember which year it was. Fortress Islington, you remember, under Margaret Hodge. Well, it didn't really turn out into a fortress so much as a sandcastle, which is what washed away by the first tide. So I think there was real problems. Secondly, you're peering to the struggles for equality. I mean, you're quite right, of course, that there were massive struggles for equality. And look how they ended up. They ended up with black sections. I mean, Diane Abbott was of the left, but she was the only one of the left. And incidentally, as someone put in the chat, she actually deselected Ernie Roberts, who was further to the left, and there was the Assistant General Secretary of the AEU. But you also had the people like Keith Vaz, and now you have people like David Lammy, etc. But there was a problem. And I mean, you again, you praise the Street Life supplement. I mean, I was always a very bitter critic of it. And I can remember one particular article, which was absolutely horrific, where a white woman, expressed her fears of walking in a crowd of black men and playing to the kind of rape fears of black people. Yes, I mean, if you go back, you will see that article. I mean, that caused quite a stir as well. So, I mean, there were pluses and minuses. I mean, one of the interesting things when we look about the anti-Semitism debate today was historically the Labour right was more pro-Palestinian or pro-Arab than the Labour left, which had been pro-Zionist. So we saw that switch around the time of the Bennite ascendancy, and then Ben himself, with Eric Hepper, resigned from Labour Friends of Israel in 1982 after the invasion of Lebanon. But yes, again, the Grand Hotel bombing, although that briefing was very good on Ireland, when it came to it, it completely misjudged the mood of the working class. I mean, I can remember, I mean, working class people, I was volunteering at an old age people's home, and the cook said, pity they didn't get Thatcher. And that was the feeling amongst the miners as well. What a great shame it was that Thatcher hadn't been done for. So I do think there were those weaknesses.
Can you wind up now, Tony, please?
Yes, sorry. I mean, there were those weaknesses in the Bennite movement, not least the ability to confront and challenge the nature of the state that we live in, which were reflected in Corbyn himself. And we obviously have paid the price with first Blair, and now Starmer. So how that goes remains to be seen. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Graham, do you want to come back in now, or do you want
Better,
to?
because otherwise I'm going to be stuck with about 40 points
Yep.
at the end, and I really want. I think these are such important points. I'd really like to give them some emphasis. So your questions, Tina, on the question of the monarchy, the constitutional issues, you're quite right. On those issues, I think the Bennite movement was way in advance of anything we had in the Corbyn years. Don't think though that it was, or I'm not saying you do think, but I recall that this went quite deep on the left. I remember one of the issues under the GLC was Ken Livingstone opening the Thames Barrier in Woolwich, and he invited the Queen, and there was a revolt among many sections of the Labour, of the left members of the GLC, which briefing gave voice to, when we printed their articles. So it went quite deep, and it wasn't just, you know, Ben's emphasis on constitutional issues. Now, on the question of the Labour Party and revolution, let me make my position quite clear. I have never said that the Labour Party can in any way be either an instrument of revolution or a revolutionary party, any more actually than the trade unions can. I mean, if anyone says, can the trade unions be transformed into a revolutionary party, you'll think they're mad. Similarly with the Labour Party if represents the arena, as you said, in which revolutionaries, in which socialists fight for their position. The point about it's unavoidable, because that is the arena. I mean, you don't deal with right-wing unions by setting up red unions, left-wing unions. What you're going to be is always where our movement actually is. If we want to find an audience, we're going to be where the movement is. Now, is the struggle in the Labour Party finished forever? It's far too early to say that. It is possible, by the way. I don't take this view that that class struggle will always find an expression in the Labour Party. I mean, it has since its creation, but it's not out of the question. In fact, I think it's quite possible that the establishment tendency in the party are so desperate never to have what they suffered under Corbyn again, that they are prepared to destroy the party. They haven't yet done it. And when we say about the left in this period, in the Bennite period and in the Corbyn period, let's be clear, the left didn't take over the party. It may have taken over it went further in some ways under Corbyn because it took over the leadership, but it didn't take over the party. The key points about the machinery of the party, the governance and legal unit, as it became, for instance, the regional officers. We can see this in the leaked report, were bastions of the far right of the party, as of course the parliamentary party was. In fact, the parliamentary party with its kitchen coup reflected the real, I would say actually, and this is not rose-tinted spectacles at all, however rotten the parliamentary party was in the 80s, it was far worse in the Corbyn years. Now, Tony says I look at the 80s through rose-coloured spectacles. Well, it's possible I do, but I don't think it's true, really. I didn't go into issues of the social contract or anything like that because I was talking about the 80s, not the 70s. And of course, the betrayals of the social contract paved the way for all of the defeats that we had. It paved the way for the Thatcher government. That's true. In fact, my memory, I remember a Tribune rally in those days. Perhaps we didn't have the membership that we had now, but we used to get, there used to be over 1,000 people at the Tribune rally at Labour Party conference. The famous occasion when Ian Mercado, dreadful in many ways, but he was good on the social contract and he attacked it from the platform. And I remember screaming from the floor. It was Jack Jones of the T&G screaming at him, and he was allowed on the platform and put his position. But there was a clear there was a clear movement on the left against the social contract. But you're right, Tony, it laid the basis for those defeats, and there were defeats, but it was qualitatively different from what happened in the 80s. The working class, as I said, it lacked that raw strength of the late 60s and early 70s, precisely because of the social contract, precisely because of the EU referendum, a different situation to the one we've had recently. But though it laid the basis for it, but the working class had not suffered that qualitative defeat, that historic defeat, which actually had an impact, I would say, was comparable to that of the 1926 general strike. And then you say, well, the local government struggle was a failure. Of course it was. It's exactly that. It wasn't just Lambeth who was, it wasn't just Liverpool who was surcharged, of course. It was Lambeth under Ted Knight. We've got our differences. We had our differences with the late, great Ted Knight, but he fought that fight. He got surcharged, as did his comrades, and it ended in failure. Well, what are you saying? Are you saying that we shouldn't have gone into that fight? It was unavoidable. That was Thatcher's target. It was Thatcher targeted the trade unions and Labour authority, left-wing Labour authorities. So of course it was a fight that could not be avoided. Yeah, Victories, Islington, I'll give you that. It was a pretty shocking headline, and there was quite a lot of others were. Just on equalities, factually untrue to say Diane Abbott was the only left-wing person of the four. How about Comrade Bernie Grant? Again, we have our differences with him, firmly on the left, and really that we shouldn't have supported Diane against Ernie Roberts. Well, it was a difficult one, and funny enough, I remember I was really in two minds, because of the two, I think you could argue, for all his own limitations, Ernie Roberts was to the left of Diane Abbott, but Diane Abbott was to the left of the party, and she was a black woman. And we really would have to justify not supporting a left-wing black woman in that constituency. I took the position, and I actually managed to persuade one of my other comrades to do the same. So we are responsible for the fact that Diane Abbott is now, has been since that time, since 1987, a left-wing Labour MP in Hackney, which didn't prevent her the day after her selection for attacking me for asking her a difficult question on her weak economics. So, but just on, I'm sorry, Tony, I just don't agree with you with the issue of equalities. I think it's something that you've frankly been historically weak on. I'm saying this because you're not going to get another bite of the cherry, so I'm going to have the last word on this. You've been historically weak on women's rights, in my opinion. And if you don't understand the historical significance of Livingstone's movements in the 80s on all of these equalities issues and just say, well, look what it's led to today, is a really, in my opinion, unhistorical view and a class reductionist view, which I don't share with you.
Thank you. There's obviously a lot of history we're working through here, so we'll hope 2 hours are enough tonight. I don't think we'll be finishing at 7:30. I think Matthew Jones has to go to a meeting, another CLP meeting, so I'll bring you in first, well, next.
Okay, thanks, comrades. As for my CLPs, and actually not till 7:30. I thought it was really going to be much earlier, but they are. Anyway, no, it's good. I mean, I think it's really interesting to go through this. I mean, I actually agree with Graham, and I think it's extremely significant that the Labour Party should select a black woman like Diane Abbott, whether or not she was technically to the left or not of Ernie Roberts, who, of course, you know, as people said, and the effect. I mean, given under conditions in which, I mean, there'd been a mass fascist movement the decade before, you know, a huge racist movement in the streets. And then the Labour Party selects the back. It's huge. It's massive, you know, and in that constituency as well. I mean, absolutely, you know, totally. And I remember, I mean, the thing is, you know, I remember, you know, it's the early 80s. I was in Coventry, so we actually proposed as the left to get as our constituency. We invited Bernie Grant to speak, and I mean the reaction from the right wing was incredible. I mean, outpouring of racism, obviously, but just you know what the significance of the guy. I mean, yeah, okay, all of these people, most of these guys all went to the right, but. You know, I mean, it was enormously significant that the Labour Party should select, you know, black MPs, you know, in those conditions. And I think also the other thing in terms of what happened in the 80s, I think the other thing, of course, was that at that point, you know, the right wing still had a social base. I mean, you're going to, you know, CLP or whatever else. You know, you would have a mass, it was a mass thing, and it was working class, solidly working class, solidly, you know, I mean, obviously in the working class area, and solidly organised. And the thing is that the significance of what happened to Thatcher, of course, was it shattered the basic organisation of the working class itself. You know, I mean, from a position in which, you know, in the CLP in Coventry, you know, you'd have a meeting of hundreds of people, literally. I mean, they'd actually have to hire a big hall to have the CLP meeting. And they were all delegates, and they were all workers, you know, or virtually all of them workers, mostly in engineering factories. Now, I mean, the thing is that what's happened, you know, what happened since, of course, is all of that got shattered. And actually, you know, a place like Coventry, they stripped out virtually all the industry. I mean, between you know, Thatcher and Blair, virtually all of it went. You know, and it's actually to the actual basis of the work. And you look at something like, you know, and I think also in terms of, say, you know, the problem for the left was not paying attention to things like the Ridley Plan, which of course was published. It was perfectly published, you know, in the Observer when it was issued when it was issued in 76, I think. You know, to say this is how we're going to deal with the unions and how we're going to destroy the miners' union. And then nobody responded and thought, okay, well, this is their strategy. How do we respond to it? And they did it. They did it. You know, all the way through. They said, okay, we'll start with the steelworkers. You know, and I remember the steelworkers dispute. I was still at school at the time. I used to go on the picket line instead of go to school. But I mean, these guys had not been on strike since 1926. And the thing was, the union actually lost control of the strike because they'd never run one. You know, the bureaucrats in charge had never run a strike. And then, you know, the thing is that the rank and file, you know, obviously in the tradition of stop stewardism and so on and so forth, people had the experience of running strikes, which they don't have. And this is the problem for really the difference, you know, is that this difference that in the Corbyn years, you don't have that organised working class. It's much more atomised, and you don't have that experience. And you know, in the 80s, at least you had a whole cadre of people who had run mass struggle, you know, and it's a completely different time. And I think the other thing, well, the thing that struck me, particularly during the miners' strike was just war. I mean, there's nothing comparable, you know. I mean, during the miners' strike, I would say that, well, you know, my Labour Party turned itself inside out. The activists turned themselves inside out. I mean, some of us just said, okay, we'll just do it full time. I mean, I remember doing 20 hours a day for the miners' strike. You know, it was an amazing time. And the thing is, it's also the NUM itself. Who dealt with the NUM was incredibly bureaucratic. It was an amazingly bureaucratic organisation. But, you know, contrary, you know, there were two things that went against it. One, they had this immense, you know, their record in the 70s, you know, because the NUM was almost completely quiescent up until 1970. And then they had this massive thing in which they brought down the government in the early 70s. And what you had was a whole generation of people, you know, effectively militants who'd been through that experience, who brought down a government, you know, who were prepared to fight on the streets for a year. You don't have those. You just don't have those people. They you know, you don't have that cadre of people, unfortunately. You know, they were prepared to stand and fight, you know, on the street, and to do all sorts of things, amazing things, you know. and it took a year for the government to break them.
Can you wind up now, comrades, please?
I just think it's a different time. I think is my response to that. I think.
Thank you. George got his hand up, but I don't think you've got a camera, so you can just unmute yourself.
I apologise for having no camera.
That's fine. Put you in the gallery view.
A couple of main points. Not only a vision Tony Benn had, but he actually attempted to put it into practice in real concrete terms. And one of them was the setting up of the Chesterfield initiatives. There were 4 years of conferences in the Winding Wheel Room in Chesterfield. And this was, if you compare that to what Corbyn did, Corbyn went all over the country talking to massive rallies, fine. But what he didn't do was he didn't develop the business of the local Labour parties and the trade unions. Whereas Tony then actually worked on workers' control. He was involved with the Lucas Aerospace thing. The other thing, of course, which you've already mentioned, which Tina has mentioned, is he attempted to bring in a bill, a Republican bill, in 1992. But not only did he want to get rid of the monarchy, he also challenged the constitutional existence of the crown. The crown, which is the glue which holds everything together. The city, the military, the judiciary, and so on. He wanted to overhaul that. And I think that in itself was groundbreaking. Of course, he did it within parliamentary means. He was a great parliamentarian, but of course, that had its limitations. But nevertheless, that was a tremendous achievement in those days. I consider the 1980s the worst period of my life, I think. I was in the 60s generation, which was slightly different. I'll conclude that. Thank you.
Thank you. Graham, would you indicate to me whenever you want to come in? Yes? Okay. Do you want to come in or not yet? Okay. Marie next.
Oh, hello. Thank you, Graham. That was superb introduction. I have just 2 points to make. It seems to me that in the period we're talking about, there were the strikes in Poland, which ended up in 1989 with the Solidarność became formed. And for a long time, or for a period, that was the workers, the actual workers of what I call myself a worker state, who were saying, we don't want this bureaucracy, we want to decide, we want to run things, we want to run the factories, we want to decide at political level. And that was to a degree accepted, because some space was made, but some bureaucrats were removed, and Solidarność won quite a few victories. And then, unfortunately, there were not the conditions on the world scale, and the Catholic Church became involved, and Solidarność became was taken over by people who were not interested in the worker state, and in fact were supported by the capitalist system. And so I think I heard you, Graham, mention of a democratic counter-revolution in Eastern Europe. Well, I would say, you know, there is nothing democratic about counter-revolution. It was a counter-revolutionary process. And unfortunately, the Soviet Union had not improved its internal comprehension, its internal understanding of what was happening. And soon in the 90s, it was going to implode. So we are now talking in Britain of a period which was one of tremendous crisis, not just in Britain, but in the world. And we were, in my opinion, losing we were losing the Soviet Union. And then what you said about China, China itself was retreating with Deng Xiaoping and so on. And so it seems to me that this is not a crisis of Stalinism or Stalinism. There was no Stalin anymore. It is the process of going from the worker state to socialism. And that was that needed an international, it needed an organization of the international communist movement, which was not there. And so therefore the impact on Britain is that the miners' strike was defeated. The second miners' strike, I think somebody mentioned the first, had actually brought down the Tories and the Heath government. And so it is not automatic that we were going to lose, but nevertheless there were not the conditions, and the miners were defeated. So it seems to me it makes sense to see that the Labour Party itself was affected by all this, because the Labour Party doesn't understand the process of the construction of socialism. I think in what Ben proposed, there are very important points, like others have said. He proposed the end of the British jurisdiction over Northern Ireland. This is still valid today. It's valid for, there is in the constitution of the constitutional monarchy of Britain, there is the crown is in Ireland, the crown is in Parliament, the crown is in the state, and it is also in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And so there is a demand now for us to draw conclusions. I propose we have another meeting to draw more conclusions about how to change, how to discuss this in the Labour Party. In the Labour Party, republicanism, such as the bill of Ben was, in the Labour Party, this is not discussed. Labour is a broad church, a popular front between New Labour liberals, you know, Tony Blair's and more to the right, and who are anti-Republican and anti-socialist, and people like Jeremy Corbyn and the movement that he had, which you could say was Republican in the sense that Corbyn did actually second Tony Benn. So Corbyn is a Republican and a socialist, but just that he did not want to break with the anti-Republican, anti-socialist wing of the party. So he has accepted the broad church. And the result of that is that he became the prey of their maneuvers, because it needed for him to actually have started on an anti-constitutional, an anti-racist, anti-imperialist, exceptionalism of British imperialism. And as he did not dispute, in fact, he did not raise the question of the monarchy, he went to accept, he accepted the Privy Council, he entered in it, and so the conclusions that Ben had drawn were not drawn back again in turn by Corbyn. And this is one of the things which need discussing, that we need to pull out, we need to create currents in the party, in the left of the Labour Party, who discusses this. Yeah, and I think that just a final point about, to go back to what I was saying about Poland, I think Russia, it's not true that Russia has completely given up and that absolutely world-shattering revolution has completely gone. This is not true. And in my opinion, Russia has stopped regime change in the world. And in Syria, it said to imperialism, you don't go any further. This is where you stop. Regime change stops here. And so that's not the behavior of the oligarchs of China, of Russia. It is the behavior of people who have an interest in not accepting that imperialism retakes the world and goes back to colonies. That will not happen. This is out. And then just a final point, do I have another minute?
Make it a quick minute now, please.
So in conclusion, for us in this country, I think we need to give much more value to this period of the 80s, which ended up with the 90s, which were the collapse of the Soviet Union, but which now have not given any strength to capitalism, because capitalism is going from ruin to failure and ruin again. And so we are going to need these ideas and to develop people who discuss these ideas.
Thank you, Marie. Graham, shall I take a couple more? We've got 3 more people who want to speak.
Let me just, I won't say as much this time, because in terms of what Matthew said, I tended to agree with a lot of it, and I don't think that I need to answer. In terms of what George said, I think I might suggest to you the criticism that was made to me, that perhaps you're seeing the 80s through rose-tinted glasses. I say this because I was also at those Chesterfield conferences, and they were great, but they didn't shift the world any more than the movement round Corbyn did, actually. I mean, the problem with Corbyn was it needed a movement, and that was basically given to an undemocratic and body, Momentum, which actually wasn't up historically to the task and made, frankly, some appalling errors. But I'm really worried about, there's the sort of implication coming out that Ben was sort of better than Corbyn. The point I try to make, I try to anticipate this by saying, yes, but he wasn't put to such a test. He wasn't leader. Yes, you said that he moved the bill, the Republican bill, is that right? I don't know about that, but it was 1992. This was after the fight was over. And what I would say is that they weren't put to the same historic test. Ben was never leader of the Labour Party. Had he been so, how far he would have gone, I don't know. But the problem that both faced, and I'll just repeat the point, was that both were coming up with a historic challenge to the class compromise which Labour and Labourism represented in the interests of the working class, whereas Blair and Starmer represent the resolution of that contradiction in the interests of the ruling class. And how far could he have gone? Because it had revolutionary implications. It raises the issue ultimately of power. And the problem is that however good a socialist is, if they don't actually face the issue of the power of the ruling class, then if you don't face up to it, you're going to be beaten by it. Now, Corbyn's problem, of course, was whatever Tony says, the working class in the Bennite period in the early 80s was strong. It was, the trade union movement was basically almost twice as many, even in numbers, as the trade union movement was under Corbyn, for goodness sake. And I mean, I don't think anyone can seriously deny that, unless you've got this view that Corbyn's election proved the fact that the working class was undefeated, which I heard one comrade come up with immediately at the time, which is absolute drivel, to be blunt. So I think there's a danger of seeing these things through rose-coloured glasses. I think that Ben had his own weaknesses, and ultimately, I think I would put them very much in the same bracket. The test of Ben didn't come in that same way. Though I do agree that the issues that Ben did raise are something that we need to have as part of our own analysis and programme on the issue of the monarchy, republicanism, the House of Lords. Now, on just Maria's point, I just want to talk about some of the international issues you raised, because I suppose I don't agree with you in some ways. I mean, you don't like the term counter-revolution, and you say democratic counter-revolution. You quite rightly say there's nothing democratic in counter-revolution. I use that term in order to try to emphasize the contradiction. Now, I hope that most of us here who were around, or had been, or if we had been around, would have been supporting those in Eastern Europe and in China fighting what was, I'm afraid I will use the word, Stalinist tyranny. Yes, Stalin was dead, but Stalinism outlived, for goodness sake, it outlived Stalin. They were fighting Stalinist tyranny, and in my opinion, and we would have been on their side. Nonetheless, in the event in Eastern Europe, those workers, those people in Eastern Europe who were fighting the authoritarianism of the wall and trying to keep in people inside East Germany, which to my mind is a ludicrous kind of, how that can ever be part of a socialist program is beyond me. So we would have supported them, but the outcome, which was the unification of East Germany, was a disaster. And yet both are true. I remember somebody I didn't agree with on the left on lots of issues, I thought got it right at the time. I was at a meeting with Ernest Mandel, who represented a section of the Trotskyist Fourth International at the time, one of the different elements within it. And he said, there is a 1% chance this movement can lead in the direction of political revolution. Let us base ourselves on that possibility. That's all we could do. And as for Tiananmen Square, well, that was an unmitigated disaster. And I'm sorry, Marie, I just don't agree with you. Let's have this discussion another time. I don't see that Russia in any way represents an element, a remnant of progress. As far as I'm concerned, it's a capitalist state. It's a smaller capitalist state than the United States, but I don't support Russia against the United States. I'm sorry if you do, and I'm sorry if you're upset that I don't, but there it is. I don't take that view, but I don't think that that's the major discussion we should be having about the Labour left of the 1980s, but it's something perhaps we should flag up for further discussion.
Yes, we are racing through a lot of history in this session, aren't we? Poor Graham, we have to answer a lot of questions on a lot of issues. We haven't even talked about the questions in the Q&A, but we'll leave that for now. Okay, we've got 4 more comrades who want to speak. Norman, please.
Yep, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep, okay. Graham, it's an absolutely fascinating lecture, and what I would say, having listened to it and have been shown us bits of briefing in a tantalizing way, wouldn't it be great to have a book, 100 years of briefing, or whatever whatever period you'd like to call it, but a book that brings together that material into a compact form. It's full of fascinating, and I've seen old briefings and newer briefings, and there's lots of great stuff to get out there. But what I'm more concerned with really is how those lessons that you've been bringing out from the 80s, how they could have been applied to the Corbyn period, and in a way why they weren't. Especially you made comments about the the nature of the Labour Party, the fact that that people understood that the Labour Party, obviously there was an obvious fact that we had a load of Labour MPs that were totally against Corbyn, possibly the whole parliamentary Labour Party in a way, apart from one or two exceptions. But yet also, as you said, there was a hidden factor, which very few people seem to know about at the time, at the Corbyn time, that you had this bureaucracy that was solidly against the Corbyn project as well. And why couldn't we have fed in the experience of the past into the Corbyn project at the time to have done something about it? In particular, and this is the thing that always kind of frustrates me about the whole thing, was that MacDonald, before Corbyn was actually the leader, he said that a Labour Party with a left-wing leader wouldn't be able to get anywhere unless it had the support of a social movement, a movement outside the Labour Party. What he was basically, I think, saying was people who were in the Labour Party and outside the Labour Party, which was the prototype of Momentum. Now, Momentum failed in a huge way, but it showed signs of being a fantastically important force, of a combination of activists of all kinds, bringing together people who are outside the party and inside the party to do great things. There was an excitement at the time that was happening. Now, briefing, as you said, had already exposed Landsman as for what he was, and he became the person who sabotaged that movement. Now, why was that, in a way, allowed to happen? Why was Momentum handed over to Landsman to take something that was such an important movement and to actually just destroy, to sabotage, to do worse than destroy, to take it and subvert it? He subverted it into other things, other causes, and turned it against the whole idea of what it should have been. I was in a local Momentum that was nothing like what Momentum became, but it was in tune with what MacDonald had originally said, which was this movement that would push, that would promote and push a parliamentary party into doing things which a parliamentary party couldn't normally do. It seems to me that somewhere along the line that there's a huge lesson to be learned there for the future, that having the movement that will push far beyond what electoral considerations have it in mind, but they will actually push the movement forward. MacDonald must have learned from what was going on with the GLC, that where the GLC was most effective, it was in harnessing the people on the streets from outside. But yeah, again, a fantastic lecture, and I was really, really interested throughout. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Norman. Steve, and then John.
Yeah, I've just unmuted myself. Yeah. Thanks, Graham. I enjoyed your talk, and it also made me rethink a little about Tony Benn, and I'll say why he did that, because it reminded me of some missing links in a story, because I think Tina got to a point in her intervention by getting to 1992 and talking about his bill, a very, very important bill that's not hardly recognised by most people on the left. But Bennite republicanism, if you want that word, it was not particularly about the Queen, although Ben did try when he was a minister in the 60s to have the Queen's head removed from the stamps, from our stamps, and he failed. But for Ben, it was all about democracy and work and about control, people having control. That was what his republicanism was really all about. And if you understand that, and Ben understood that the power of the ruling class is embodied in the crown. And I don't mean by the crown the Queen, by the way, but really the power of the state which the crown embodies. He understood that both because of his experience as a minister of the crown and as his experience as a socialist who fought the class struggle. And that, so when he did the bill in 1992, he didn't just fly in from another planet. Okay, it came out of his experiences in the previous decades. He got to put that bill together, put that effort into doing that, because he'd come to some conclusions about the nature of power in our society, which the left was not dealing with. So and again, it's not about the Queen. So when the Queen turns up, as you mentioned, the example to do the Thames barrier, that caused a revolt amongst Labour councillors. But the point was, it's not really, it's like the Queen is just a reminder that we're a class-ridden and undemocratic society. So when that's thrown in your face, you can't sit there and do nothing about it. But it's, again, it's not about the Queen, it's the power of the state. And so I think when your story goes back, that you rightly began at the very beginning of the story of the Labour Party, a broad church with, sometimes it's called with capitalists and influence of capitalists and workers. It was often called the bourgeois workers' party, as a broad church of these two different competing forces. But if you thought about it politically, you could also say it's a broad church of loyalists and Republicans. Well, the loyalist wing of the Labour Party is the PLP. They're loyal to capital, they're loyal to the crown, and they're the dominant force within the Labour Party. Republicanism really didn't play very much at all in the history of the Labour Party. But when Ben comes on the scene, the Bennite movement, when you start to describe what the Bennite movement was about, you started to bring in the values of liberty, these values of republicanism, liberty, equality, and solidarity. Now, the examples you gave, and this is why I thought it reminded me, where did it all come from? You started to talk about all the freedom struggles, Ireland, South Africa, Poland, and of course the one about Greenham Common was the freedom from US missiles. And then you remind us all of the importance of equality, the struggles over women and Black and Asian rights and gay rights, etc. And of course, we had the Peter Tatchell story. And then the solidarity with the miners. Now, this is all about a kind of popular republicanism. It doesn't necessarily call itself republicanism. And then that goes into saying that the Labour Party is not democratic, is it? And they're struggling in the Labour Party. So what is the Labour Party? If it's not a republic where the members are sovereign, what the hell is it then? And you said quite rightly, constitutionally, the great quote that you gave us, constitutionally, the members appear to be sovereign in the Labour Party, but in reality, the executive, the power above the PLP and the trade union bureaucracy held all the power. It's almost as if the king had the power rather than the members. So again, you know, the struggle for democracy is also, again, part of that of doing it. And although you didn't mention this, the local government struggle is important, but also I'd put the poll tax into the picture. I'm sure you'd include that, because that was a mass struggle from below about democracy as well as taxation, and that was also part of that. So when you see that Ben is taking democracy, equality, freedom, and re-injecting those into the socialist movement dominated by Stalinism, which wasn't particularly worried about any of those things, by the way, of the traditional left, then you can understand what happens in 1992 when Ben gets to write his bill. He takes that to the point of saying, well, this is where I've got to. Let's have something which is much more about power, democracy. Let's get on to that. And I think that's where he got to. Somebody said in the chat, I think, that, well, Ben wrote his bill after the struggles of the 80s were defeated. Yes, but that's true. He didn't write it earlier on, but I think he wrote it as a consequence of those struggles, rather than just simply sitting down in 1992 and thinking, I'll write this bill for no particular reason, and don't worry, nobody will take any notice of it. So I go back to what Marie and George said and what Tina said. It's a very, very important, partly conclusion of his struggles.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve. We've got John, and then I put no other hands up, so Graham will be able to sum up then afterwards. Hi, John.
Hi, thanks for that, Graham. An excellent summary of the 1980s, and informative, even though many of us were around at the time and witnessed much of it. My only dispute with you seems to be around your assessment of comparing the Thatcher era, the 1980s, with what happened in the modern era. In the 20th century, 21st century, following the 2008 crash. In the 1980s, we suffered mass unemployment. Thatcher imposed unemployment upon the working class as a tool of control, as a tool to break the trade union movement, and it imposed a whole raft of changes across life as a whole, that removed power from the working class and entrenched it in the business class, the ruling elite. And I just wondered if you could perhaps comment on that and maybe expand on it slightly, because I think that what we suffered in the 1980s led to all that's gone wrong for the last 40 years. The Thatcher's introduction of Neo-Liberalism, which was continued under the Blair era and continued under Cameron and May, has set the stage for the current mess that the country and the world is in as a result.
Thank you, John. Okay, Graham, if you would like to sum up now and answer any outstanding
Well,
questions.
let me just deal with the last point first. I do agree with you, John, that the 1980s and Thatcher laid the basis for everything that's happened since. I just didn't want to present it as a straight line. There was the intervening factor of the 2008 crash, which has had an enormous impact. That's only the real point I'm trying to make, that it wasn't, oh, well, it was all set in the 80s, everything just flows from that. There was this intervening point. Now, I mean, it's not really much to answer Steve Freeman about, because I tend to agree with you. I mean, look, the poll tax movement came at the very, very end of the decade and the beginning of the next one. And what was it? Thatcher was unseated as a result of the poll tax movement. Was it November 1980, I think? So 1990. So it's just the end of that period. And I take that point. Just on Norman's point, there's not really much to answer here. Why weren't we aware? I mean, look, I was sort of making a bit of a pedagogue, or whatever the word is. I was making a point. I've got to be careful not to use words I can't pronounce. I was making a point about Landsman because it just struck me as a bit humorous that we had a couple of articles as early as 1986, but these were not really big deals. Remember that come Corbyn, I mean, Landsman had been out for totally understandable, by the way, personal reasons. He'd been out of politics in the meantime. Not a criticism at all, by the way, of that. And he had come back soon before the rise of Corbyn. And he played, there's two things I need to say this, because we've got to get a balanced view. Firstly, he had played a key role because of his position as working in the back doors of Parliament in getting the nominations for Corbyn at the last moment. There's no doubt he played a key role. And there's no doubt he was a genuine Corbynite. I mean, I always tell this story at that conference when the result came through and we were all happy and all of that, although I remember thinking this is as good as it's going to get because, you know, I had some understanding. But I remember just as I came out, seeing John Landsman sat in a corner all by himself, tears of joy down his face. I mean, look, let's be really clear. He was CLPD. He once said, and I think it's true, he said, I'm not a Bennite, although he was. I'm a Derrorite, who was the leader of CLPD. He's not a kind of agent of the right. He was a figure of the left whose weaknesses really only came out, I think, in 2015 onwards. Yes, there were signs if for those nerds like me who look at 1986 briefings, but believe me, most of the Labour movement, most of the organised working class have never seen this issue of Labour briefing or these issues of Labour briefing in 1986. And all you could ever say about John is that he represented that reformist left, the Bennite left, and I suppose he didn't have a Marxist bone in his body, but that hardly distinguished him. And I think that the criticism, therefore, has got to be understood in that context. The criticism is, there's two things. One, momentum was given to him on a plate, despite the promise that there was going to be some kind of democratic shared control of left formations. But even had it been healthy, Corbyn faced this incredible problem, it seems to me. And I don't want to just be, if you like, just criticising on the sidelines, though I'm happy to do that. But it's got to be more than that. The contradiction that Corbyn faced was he was the most left-wing leader in Labour's history, bar none. By far the most left-wing leader in Labour's history, with a working class that was weak and defeated and actually wasn't able to put the pressure on him, nor was it there at his disposal. That's the first thing. And the second contradiction that Corbyn faced was this, that if you were going to be a force for change, this opportunity of a lifetime, it needed a movement from below that was going to challenge the power of the Parliamentary Labour Party. It had to do it. And the failure to do it was a profound mistake. On the other hand, I could also understand the pressures, because here was a Labour opposition under Corbyn that was operating within a parliamentary system that actually had to put a parliamentary opposition on the road. How do you do it when, and I saw in chat, and Tony's right here, that unlike the PLP of the 80s, was it a third that voted for Ben? I didn't think it was that much, but it might have been. It was something like that. Whereas those who voted for Corbyn were insignificant. In terms of really, really strong support, probably no more than 20. So it meant building a coalition with the right and putting all these people in their posts. Now, he could have said, "Oh, blow Parliament, bullets, not ballots, to the barricades, comrades. This isn't the main thing," which would have been a fine decision, by the way, in a period of a revolutionary period, which this most certainly was not. So I'm not actually saying he took the right decisions, because from day one, despite all of that, he did have at his disposal a membership that was rising all the time, and up to 600,000, which Ben didn't have at his disposal, that could have been mobilised, one, to get rid of the General Secretary from day one, pay him off, no doubt about that, and secondly, to go beyond the gains of Wembley 1981, gone for open selection. And of course, Corbyn was helped in this by various sections of the trade union bureaucracy who covered his back. It was a wrong call. But all I'm saying is, I make sometimes a rather trite point. After the last election, I was asked, what would you have done differently? And I just said, well, when Boris Johnson had opposition in the Tory ranks, he just sacked them all. And when Corbyn had opposition in his ranks, he apologised to them and conceded to them. That's true. But it also misses out a fundamental point, that whereas Boris Johnson had essentially the ruling class on his side, some issues about the referendum, I agree, make that bit more complicated, but Boris Johnson had the ruling class on his side, whereas Corbyn was going to be an insurrection against the establishment, or else it was going to be nothing. And because it wasn't, it ended up, in effect, petering out. So it's too easy, isn't it, I think, just to say, what worries me that we're getting this indication of Ben good, Corbyn bad. Different period, different balance of forces. I actually think they came very much from the same school of politics, of left reformism. This isn't soft left, by the way. Ben wasn't soft left and Corbyn wasn't soft left. In social democratic reformist terms, they were hard left. They were, in some terms, and sometimes called loony left. And that's what they were. So it's just too easy to say they should have done this and that without recognising the balance of forces. Recognising the balance of forces, let me make it clear, they should still Corbyn should still have stood up against the false narrative on anti-Semitism, against the witch hunt, for open selection, and all of those issues. That's me not excusing it, but I'm trying to understand it. And so therefore, why weren't the lessons learned? Well, partly the new intake of the left was really enthusiastic in 2015 into the party, was really enthusiastic, but although there was a lot of oldies around, there was a lot of new comrades who momentum either miseducated or failed to educate. And that's one thing. But secondly, you know, conditions determine consciousness. And you can only have a consciousness of strength if you're actually strong. We had the beginnings of strength there, but it had to be built. So just last thing, I'll just suppose if we're trying to translate this into what we do now, there was 100 people here or 80 people here now, whatever, and that means 90 opinions. But what we do about the Labour Party, don't give up on the Labour Party until we're forced to. It's, I've seen too much of it, people just saying, well, let's leave, I'm fed up, I'm going to join something else. Well, what? And I think that it may well come to it, though, that we are forced out. I mean, I've been forced out, who gives a damn? But we could be forced out collectively from the Labour Party. The trade unions could be forced out of the Labour Party. Then we're in a different ball game. And it may be we then start the long struggle to rebuild a party of Labour. And my view, and it's a discussion I've had with some comrades, if there isn't a Labour Party, what do we want? My view is we want a movement of the working class in this country as part of an international movement, a broad movement in which socialists, revolutionaries, Marxists fight for leadership, not to transform it into a revolutionary party, but in order to try to use its influence and power in the movement to transform the movement itself. And that is going to be the key. So a broad movement under revolutionary leadership, whether that can be in the Labour Party or whether the extent to which the Labour Party can be used in this is a question that actually is the issue of our times. As and I keep making the quote, I'm probably bored, people are bored listening to it, and I'm almost bored saying it, but Gramsci said, if you remember, in the late 1920s, from prison, the old world is dying, the new world is struggling to be born, now is the time of monsters. Well, if ever words were helpful to us, in the sense they tell us where we are, this is it. But we know where we are, we know it's difficult, what next? And that's where these kind of discussions, learning from history, can help us formulate the next steps, which I must say are less obvious now than they've been ever in my lifetime. Thank you.
Absolutely. That was a very good summing up. Thank you very much, comrade.